Election night in the late 1850s carried a tension that did not quite fit the cheerful noise spilling across the roads and taverns of the South. It was a night where politics gave powerful men permission to drink loudly, laugh too freely, and boast without consequence. Beneath the glow of lanterns and the echo of their triumph, there existed another world, one quieter, darker, and far more honest. In that world with enslaved men and women who watched from porches, kitchens, and shadow corners, their expressions masked, their thoughts chained behind their eyes. They moved like ghosts through the celebration, unacknowledged yet carrying memories far heavier than the flags and posters nailed to the courthouse doors. The November air felt sharp, charged, almost metallic. It was the kind of cold that clung to the bones and sharpened every sound. In the town square, men gathered around barrels of fire, shouting predictions about new laws and political promises. A few local militia officers strutted near the courthouse steps, their boots echoing like war drums on the planks. But behind the political theater, behind the cheers and the raised glasses, lay the unseen tension between oppressor and oppressed, a tension that silence often disguised but never erased. On the outskirts of this noise, the Grayson plantation glowed with its own brand of celebration. Oil lamps flickered through the tall windows, casting warped silhouettes of guests moving in and out of parlors. The sound of laughter drifted down the path toward the slave quarters, where people worked faster than usual, preparing food, setting tables, carrying wood, each step measured with the precision of survival. They could not afford mistakes on a night like this, not with so many eyes, drunken and sober, watching. For Benjamin, the night felt heavier than others. He had grown used to the patterns of plantation life, used to hearing political victories marked with excessive drinking, boasting, and inevitable cruelty. Yet this year felt different. There was a strange hum beneath his ribs, something between dread and clarity, as if unseen hands had quietly turned the gears of fate, setting them in motion long before the sun went down. Benjamin moved through the Grayson household with the quiet certainty of someone who had memorized every creaking floorboard and potential danger. His body had learned to anticipate harm in ways no child should have. Years on a plantation had trained him to read the slightest shift in a white man's voice, the faintest twitch of annoyance, the subtle prelude to anger. But tonight, Master Grayson was in a celebratory mood, a dangerous kind of happiness, the sort that made him careless with words and reckless with demands. Guests crowded the dining hall, their coats smelling of tobacco, leather, sweat, and the cold wind outside. Women in stiff, shining dresses whispered behind fans, pretending not to notice how the men drank beyond courtesy. Benjamin moved around the room serving glasses, his presence acknowledged only through orders barked in his direction. Yet even in his invisibility, he observed everything. The way Grayson boasted about his influence in local politics, the way certain men hung on his every word, the way others smirked behind his back in jealous contempt. But politics meant nothing to Benjamin. Not the elections, not the speeches, not the promises for a stronger South. These decisions never benefited him, or anyone like him. They only strengthened the iron bars around their lives. He knew that every candidate on the ballot was another link in the same chain. Election night for him was not a celebration. It was a reminder that the world beyond the plantation gate was built on laws forged to keep him broken. Still, he listened. Frederick, one of the older enslaved men working in the hall, told him once that it was important to listen to the words of powerful men. Not because they matter, he whispered, but because their plans hold the shape of our suffering. Benjamin never forgot that. The night grew louder as the voting results trickled in. Someone outside fired a celebratory shot into the air. Inside, Grayson smacked the dinner table hard enough to rattle the silverware as he yelled, "I told you we would keep control. This state don't need change. It needs order." The word felt sharp in Benjamin's ears. Order. It was the same word Grayson used when he beat him. The same word he used when he separated families. The same word sewn into every cruel decision he made. Benjamin carried another tray of drinks, his expression steady despite the storm that churned inside him. Grayson barely glanced at him as he took another glass, but his eyes carried that familiar mix of arrogance and ownership. Those eyes had haunted Benjamin since he was a child, when Grayson first realized that fear could break a boy faster than a whip. And yet, fear wasn't what lived in Benjamin now. Something colder had settled inside him, something that felt almost like certainty. It had grown over the years, watered by humiliation, injustice, and a constant reminder that his life belonged to a man who valued cigars more than the human beings who worked his fields. As the night deepened, Grayson retreated from the noisy hall, waving Benjamin to follow. The master's face glowed red from drink, his smile wide with drunken confidence. "Bring me the cedar box," he slurred, sinking into his leather chair. "Tonight calls for the good ones." Benjamin hesitated only long enough to mask the flicker in his eyes before turning toward the cabinet. He felt the weight of every footstep, the gravity of every breath. He opened the polished cedar box slowly, the scent of tobacco rising like something ancient and bitter. He selected a cigar, one Grayson had bragged about for months, and set it on a small silver tray. The parlor around them buzzed with the muffled celebration from the other room. Outside, distant shouts announced another county result. The world was shifting in ways that would harm him, harm everyone like him. Yet the master before him remained wrapped in the comfort of his own power. Grayson reached for the cigar. Without looking up, Benjamin stepped back, hands clasped behind him in the posture forced on him since childhood. The flame of the match flickered briefly before catching, illuminating Grayson's face in a wash of orange glow. The first drag filled the room with thick smoke, sweet but sharp. Benjamin watched without blinking, not because he wished to see suffering, but because he needed to know that the moment had arrived, that the night chosen by fate had truly begun. Behind them, the house pulsed with drunken laughter. The world celebrated a new chapter of political dominance, unaware that in a single room, lit by lamplight and cigar smoke, another history was unfolding. A quieter history, a darker one, a story born not from politics, but from pain carried too long by a man who had learned all too well how the powerful use nights like this to strengthen the chains around the powerless. Benjamin inhaled slowly, the smell of smoke burning itself into memory. Somewhere in the distant fields, a dog barked once and went silent. The cold wind pushed against the window panes, rattling them like distant bones. And through it all, Benjamin stood still, knowing that while others celebrated the triumph of their candidate, something else, something far more irreversible, had already begun in the heart of the Grayson plantation. Benjamin's life had been defined not by moments of choice, but by the forced obedience demanded of him from the moment he could walk. Each year, each season, each command carved new lines across his spirit. When he was young, he still held on to something like hope, thin and fragile but present. His mother had whispered stories into his ear at night, stories of strength, of dignity, of people who survived suffering by keeping their minds free even when their bodies were chained. She had been taken from the plantation when Benjamin was barely old enough to understand what loss meant. Yet her words stayed with him, drifting through his memory like lingering smoke. Those stories were the only inheritance he ever received. Master Grayson, however, had a different vision for Benjamin. He saw strength in the boy early, a broad back, quick hands, a stare too steady for his liking. To Grayson, these traits were not signs of a developing mind or growing confidence. They were threats that needed shaping. He believed obedience had to be sculpted through pain, and he took pride in the way Benjamin's early years were marked with punishments meant to break him. The crack of the cane, the forced labor under the hottest sun, the humiliations delivered in front of others. They didn't merely discipline Benjamin. They forged the beginnings of a quiet, simmering resolve deep inside him, something that had no name yet but moved like a shadow in his mind. As Benjamin grew older, the violence became less frequent but more targeted. Grayson believed in refinement, in teaching his enslaved servants the illusion of dignity as long as it benefited him. Benjamin was pulled from the fields and trained to work in the household instead, carrying cigars, pouring drinks, serving guests in polished rooms lined with portraits of men who preached freedom while building empires from stolen labor. This shift in work did not spare him from cruelty. If anything, it made the punishments more psychological, more precise. A raised eyebrow from a guest, a perceived mistake in pouring wine, a dish placed half an inch off-center. Any of these could result in a reprimand Grayson delivered with cold precision. Yet this new role also gave Benjamin something the plantation owner never intended: knowledge. He learned the rhythms of the household, the habits of the family, The secrets whispered after too many glasses of bourbon. He listened more than he spoke. He watched more than he revealed. This was how he survived. How many enslaved people survived? By becoming so aware of danger that they could sense it before it arrived. What no one realized was that Benjamin had an extraordinary memory. He remembered everything. The slightest detail, the smallest behavior, the faintest expression. He recorded it all behind a calm exterior that fooled even those who believed they knew him. He remembered the things Grayson said when he thought no one was listening, the remarks about discipline keeping men civilized, or fear being the cheapest form of order. He remembered the way Grayson boasted to guests about breaking in strong slaves as if they were animals. He remembered every insult, every blow. Every night he lay awake with the sting of punishment still throbbing beneath his skin. His life was a mosaic of these moments, each one building towards something he could not yet name. But pain, when carried long enough, begins to reshape itself. It becomes a lens, a filter through which every new injustice is measured. And Benjamin, for all his quiet obedience, had grown adept at measuring. The estate itself offered no sanctuary. The slave quarters were cramped, cold, and built for wood so thin it trembled in the smallest wind. Conversations at night were kept low, meant to carry only to nearby ears. Yet within that darkness, Benjamin found what little comfort existed: communal resilience. Older men and women shared stories meant to remind the younger ones that their humanity stretched beyond the plantation lines. They recited fragments of African songs, whispered prayers shaped from blended traditions, and passed along bits of wisdom meant to outlive them. Benjamin sat near these exchanges, absorbing every piece of knowledge as if gathering tools. Tools that might someday matter. Tools Grayson would never suspect he carried. His suffering was not singular. It was echoed in the lives of everyone around him. But Benjamin's path diverged because his suffering did not vanish into silence. It condensed, hardened, sharpened into something that began to resemble intent. There were moments, fleeting, private, when he imagined a life where Grayson's shadow no longer stretched across his days. He hated himself for thinking it at first. Self-preservation under slavery often demanded emotional numbness, a suppression of desire. Dreaming too vividly was dangerous. Wanting too deeply could break a person faster than any whip. Yet Benjamin could not stop the thoughts. They came like storms, quiet first, then thunderous. He did not imagine freedom, not in any realistic sense. Freedom was a distant shore seen only in rumors, praise and stories told by travelers who passed through town, or whispered by enslaved people who heard it from someone who heard it from someone else. Benjamin's mind did not drift toward such distant possibilities. Instead, his thoughts circled around a man who had shaped his life more than any other, the man who molded his scars, who controlled his days, who defined his identity without permission: Grayson. The master's face appeared in Benjamin's mind more than any memory from childhood, more than any fleeting joy he had ever experienced. It appeared not with fear anymore, but with a cold clarity that frightened even him at times. He began to notice things he had once ignored. How Grayson exhaled cigar smoke with reverence, holding the thin roll of tobacco like a ceremonial object. How he tapped the tip twice before lighting it. How the smell lingered in the parlor long after Grayson left. Benjamin watched these rituals for years, memorizing them with the same precision he applied to everything else. But now, as he grew older and his quiet resentment deepened, the observations gained new meaning. The idea of using Grayson's beloved cigars against him did not appear in a single moment of anger. It grew slowly, rooted in countless experiences, watered by humiliation, disciplined by caution. It settled into Benjamin's mind like a seed planted too deeply to remove. At first, it frightened him. The thought felt like betrayal of his own survival instinct. But then came the realization, a quiet, profound shift, that he no longer feared Grayson the way he once had. What he feared was a lifetime that looked exactly like the years he had already endured. The more his body carried the marks of his past, the more his spirit edged towards something deliberate. Grayson's cruelty had shaped Benjamin, but not in the way the master expected. It had built a man who understood danger intimately, who learned to move silently through it. and who recognized that the smallest opportunity could change everything permanently. By the time election night arrived, Benjamin was no longer the boy who flinched at shadows. He was a man who walked with a calmness that scared those who knew him best, a calmness that came not from peace, but from conviction. He had waited, endured, watched. He had survived long enough for a new certainty to take root within him. Now, his mind no longer lingered on the suffering he had endured. It lingered on the possibility of ending it. It was not the idea of poison itself that first drew Benjamin's attention. It was the plants. For years, he had been the one sent into the woods to gather roots and herbs from the midwife or the older women in the quarters who brewed salves for fevers, cuts, and infections. He watched how they crushed leaves between their fingers, releasing scents both sharp and soothing. He listened to the whispers of knowledge passed down through generations, what healed, what numbed, what soothed, and what could stop a heartbeat as silently as a closing door. It was knowledge enslaved people guarded carefully, not out of malice, but because survival demanded it. Illness rarely brought medical help from the main house, and injuries were treated with whatever nature offered. Benjamin learned these secrets without intending to use them for anything more than tending to the wounded or easing suffering among his own people. But knowledge, once gained, is difficult to confine to a single purpose. And as the years progressed, as Grayson's casual cruelty deepened into something more calculated, Benjamin began to understand how danger and remedy shared the same soil. A leaf crushed one way brought relief. Prepared another way, it could become a weapon. The more he handled these herbs, the more he noticed small details. How certain roots produced a bitterness strong enough to dry the tongue. How certain oils, when mixed into tobacco, changed not the taste but the effect. He never experimented, never dared. Yet he stored the information in the quiet places of his mind, the same way he stored everything else. There was a moment, small, almost invisible, when the idea began to form. One afternoon, Grayson had called Benjamin to his study, furious about a spilled drink in the dining hall. Benjamin had not been the one who spilled it, but the truth did not matter. Grayson struck him across the face with the back of his hand, then hit him again for not falling fast enough to his knees. Benjamin remembered the dull ringing in his ears, the metallic taste in his mouth, and the way Grayson complained afterward that a cigar had gone out during the punishment. The master cursed the tobacco, cursed the humidity, cursed everything except the cruelty he had inflicted. Benjamin stood in silence as Grayson relit the cigar. The flame illuminated the man's face, drawing deep lines across his satisfied smirk. The smell of the cigar filled the room, thick and sweet. It was then that the thought flickered. Not fully formed, not yet a plan, just a spark. The cigar had the master's full attention even in the midst of violence. It was his pride, his habit, his luxury, his blind spot. If anything ever reached Grayson's throat untouched by suspicion, it would be through that rolled leaf he cherished more than any person in his life. Benjamin pushed the thought away at first, shaken by the danger of even imagining such a thing. He returned to his work with stiff movements, acutely aware of the heat blooming on the side of his face. But the spark he had tried to extinguish did not die. Instead, it settled deeper into him, as though waiting. The true turning point came weeks later, during a rare moment of quiet. Benjamin had been sent to deliver herbs to the midwife, who was tending to a sick child in the quarters. The air was heavy with the scent of earth and smoke, and the midwife, old enough to have seen generations rise and fall, worked methodically. She used a mix of crushed seeds and boiled leaves, murmuring instructions to the mother about dosages. Benjamin watched silently, handing her what she needed, learning without asking. At one point, she paused and looked at him closely. "You have steady hands," she said. "Not many do. Steady hands can save lives." He nodded but said nothing. The midwife dipped her fingers into a bowl filled with a dark, bitter mixture. "But the same knowledge," she added in a lower voice, "can do more than save." She glanced at him again, her eyes sharp with meaning. "The world don't give us many weapons, but the earth has always been generous." Benjamin knew better than to respond. Knowledge like this was passed not through words but through silence. He helped her finish the remedy, then walked back toward the main house with a strange pull inside him. It was not anger this time. It was clarity. He realized that everything he had learned about herbs, about their strength and danger, existed as a kind of quiet power, a power available only to those who understood how to wield it. Months passed, and Benjamin continued observing Grayson's habits with a changed perspective. The master's love for cigars bordered on obsession. He kept them in a cedar box lined with velvet, locked most of the time except when he needed to show off to guests. He spoke of them like treasures, hand-rolled, imported, carefully aged. Benjamin was the only enslaved person allowed to handle the box regularly, trusted only because Grayson believed complete dominance ensured loyalty. Ironically, it was the master's arrogance that created the perfect opening. Benjamin began studying the cigars more closely. He learned how tightly they were wrapped, how easily they could be opened and resealed if done with patience. He tested nothing, tried nothing risky, only observed, mentally mapping out each step the process would require. He realized the poison could not be powdered or liquid. It would alter the outer leaf or dampen the tobacco. But certain plants, when dried and ground, blended seamlessly into the inner layers. Smoke could disguise their bitterness. Once inhaled, the poison would travel quickly, silently. His plan formed slowly, shaped by necessity rather than impulse. He knew it would require timing. It could not be done during an ordinary night, when someone might notice something out of place, or when Grayson's mood might shift unpredictably. It needed a moment filled with distraction, noise, movement, drinking, a night when everyone's eyes were elsewhere. Election night would bring exactly that. Benjamin did not rush. He watched the weeks unfold with the patience of someone who understood that one wrong move could cost his life and the lives of anyone connected to him. He learned which plants would work best, how to prepare them without drawing suspicion, how to dry them in a way that made them indistinguishable from tobacco fragments. And when he walked through the woods collecting what he needed, he did so with the quiet certainty that every step was one he had been walking toward his entire life. It wasn't desperation fueling him anymore. It was purpose, a purpose shaped by survival, sharpened by memory, and guided by knowledge older than the plantation itself. The cigar, once a symbol of his master's leisure and luxury, now took on a different meaning. It became the thread linking Benjamin's past suffering to the possibility of a different future, one where the balance of power might shift, even if only for a moment, even if only in one direction. And so the plan settled into place, not in a rush of emotion, but in a slow, careful accumulation of resolve. Benjamin prepared himself not for vengeance, but for something quieter, an end to the looming presence that had dictated every breath he had taken for decades, an end delivered not through violence or rebellion, but through the same object Grayson cherished almost religiously. A man could be blinded by what he loved. Grayson was no exception, and Benjamin, with his steady hands and sharper mind, was ready to use that blindness to craft a fate Grayson would never see coming. Election night on the plantation carried its own strange rhythm, one built from a mixture of celebration, arrogance, and the kind of political obsession that only wealthy Southern men seemed capable of. Benjamin had lived through enough of these nights to understand their patterns. The men drank more heavily. Their laughter grew louder, their tempers more unpredictable. They spoke of votes, of influence, of shaping the future of the state, as though that future were not built upon the backs of the people they owned. For them, election night was a kind of ritualistic performance, a ceremony of power. For the enslaved, it was a night to move carefully, to anticipate danger before it materialized. But this year was different, not because of the election itself, but because Benjamin had decided it would be. As the day approached, the estate buzzed with preparations. Tables were arranged, food was prepared, lanterns were hung along the veranda, and barrels of liquor were rolled out for Grayson's guests. Benjamin watched everything with a composed expression, noting each detail with a precision that came naturally to him. He was not anxious. Anxiety required uncertainty, and for the first time in his life, Benjamin felt certain of what he was about to do. Grayson was unusually restless the morning before the gathering. He paced along the porch, discussing local politics with his overseer, speaking in a tone that swelled with self-importance. He expected victory, both in the election and in the role he imagined he played in shaping community influence. His ego was always inflated, but election night pushed it past its usual boundaries. Benjamin, as always, served quietly nearby, pouring drinks, lighting cigars, fetching the morning newspaper, which made him the perfect listener to every arrogant boast, every careless word. Grayson didn't notice the subtle shift in Benjamin's demeanor. Why would he? He believed he knew everything about his household, that those beneath him were incapable of complex thought, much less a hidden resolve. Benjamin maintained his usual calmness, masking the fact that the plan he had crafted over months was now entering its final stages. Nothing about his movements gave away the storm that was gathering behind his steady eyes. The poison had already been prepared in advance, crushed and dried into a fine texture that blended seamlessly with tobacco. Benjamin had gathered it during a brief walk through the edge of the woods days earlier, returning with a small pouch hidden beneath the fabric of his coat. Preparing it required patience, timing, and absolute silence. Opportunities he carved out late at night, when the quarters were quiet and only the soft crackling of the old trees filled the air. Now, the final task remained. Grayson's cigar box sat on his writing desk, as it always did, protected by a small brass key the master kept carelessly on his vest. But Grayson had a habit of forgetting that key whenever he drank too much or grew too absorbed in conversation. Benjamin had cataloged these moments for years, storing them like pieces of puzzle he knew he would someday fit together. That afternoon, the opportunity appeared with unsettling simplicity. Grayson had requested his blue election night coat, the one tailored to enhance his broad frame and hide his growing waistline. He went upstairs to try it on, calling for Benjamin shortly after. When Benjamin entered the room, he found Grayson wrestling with the buttons, cursing at the mirror. The master ordered him to fetch a different waistcoat from the bottom drawer of the desk. Benjamin moved toward the desk, opening the drawer, and as he did, his eyes flicked upward. There, carelessly left behind, sat the brass key. It was a single heartbeat of hesitation. Then he pocketed the key in a motion, so smooth it might have been accidental. Grayson noticed nothing. His attention was consumed by his appearance, by the image he intended to project later that night. A man of power, of respect, of authority. Benjamin retrieved the waistcoat, placed it neatly before the master, and stepped back silently. No tremor betrayed him, no sign of the secret now weighing lightly against his leg. Later, when Grayson descended to greet arriving guests, Benjamin knew it was time. He slipped into the study under the guise of tidying the room. The walls, lined with books and portraits, seemed to lean closer, as though witnessing something they had never been meant to see. He moved deliberately toward the desk, produced a key, and opened the cedar box. The lid lifted with a soft sigh, releasing a familiar scent of tobacco and cedar into the room. Benjamin stared at the cigars for a moment, not with hesitation, but with recognition. These objects had brought him into countless rooms where he did not belong, where he served men who discussed policies that dictated the fate of people like him. Cigars were symbols of power, leisure, hierarchy. Grayson loved them not just for their taste, but for what they represented: dominance, status, indulgence. It felt fitting that the very object Grayson adored would be the vessel of his undoing. Benjamin selected one cigar from the top row, the one Grayson always reached for first. He opened it with careful fingers, loosening only what was necessary. Then, with the precision of a surgeon, he blended the prepared plant mixture into the tobacco, pressing it gently, disguising it perfectly among the tightly packed leaves. He rolled the outer layer back into place, sealing it so cleanly that even Grayson's practiced eye would never suspect manipulation. He replaced the altered cigar, closed the box, locked it, and returned the key to the exact position where it had rested, on the corner of the desk, careless and exposed. Everything looked untouched, undisturbed. Benjamin stepped back and inhaled slowly. Nothing in the room betrayed what had just happened. The box looked exactly as it always had. The cigar looked identical to the others. The room stood silent, unaware that it had become the birthplace of something irreversible. When Benjamin returned to the main hall, the atmosphere had shifted. Lanterns glowed in warm amber hues. Guests filled the rooms with loud voices and political predictions. Grayson stood at the center of it all like a self-proclaimed king, shaking hands, boasting about turnout numbers, relishing the praise he received before the votes were even counted. The air hummed with tension and anticipation. the kind that drowned out smaller movements and smaller intentions. Benjamin continued his duties as though nothing had changed, serving drinks, clearing plates, tending to candles. No one watched him. No one ever truly did. That invisibility, once a burden, now served as his greatest shield. And when Grayson finally reached the cigar box later that night, tapping the lid lightly before opening it, Benjamin stood only a few feet away, close enough to observe without drawing attention. Grayson lifted the exact cigar Benjamin had prepared. He smiled, satisfied, unaware of the hands that had altered his fate, unaware of the eyes that watched him with a calmness born not from malice, but from a long, deep history of suffering transformed into resolve. Benjamin turned away before the match was struck, blending into the shadows of the room as the first flame touched tobacco. He had done what he came to do. The rest would unfold on its own. The whispers that spread through Culleton County in the days after the election were not the kind carried by loud men with tankards or brash politicians claiming victory before dawn. These whispers came softly, trailing behind the smell of tobacco smoke and burned paper, curling like the last exhale of a dying man. People said the master had been cursed. Others said he'd been careless. A few, speaking only when the road was empty, said a slave had finally taken his revenge. Slow, deliberate, and poetic enough to sound like something from an old folk tale. But the truth was stranger, heavier, and far more human than any rumor dared to carry. The master, Charles Redham, had always believed himself untouchable, born into money, surrounded by land that sustained him like a second heartbeat, and accustomed to obedience so automatic it barely had value. He lived with the sort of confidence men mistake for destiny. Election night only inflated that arrogance. He walked through the house waving his newly imported cigars, telling guests he'd paid an outrageous sum for the box, boasting that they were rolled by men whose hands were blessed by the soil of Havana itself. He laughed loudly, too loudly, and the people around him forced smiles as if afraid that contradicting his joy would bring down some personal misfortune. But the slaves in the back buildings had seen a different version of Charles Redham for years. They had seen the rage that lived behind his booming voice, the impatience that cracked like a whip, and the satisfaction he took in punishing those who couldn't defend themselves. Among those who knew him best was a man named Benjamin, who had long ceased expecting fairness or kindness. He'd been taught early that the world wasn't built with people like him in mind. But he also carried something that Charles never imagined a slave could possess: the ability to wait. Benjamin had endured years of punishment disguised as lessons. He'd been struck for being too slow, too fast, too curious, too silent. He'd watched Redham beat an older slave for dropping a candle holder. He'd watched him break a young boy for daring to look him in the eye. Each act carved itself into Benjamin's memory like marks on an invisible tally. He never forgot, and he never reacted, not outwardly. The stillness he wore became a shield, one Redham interpreted as obedience when it was actually calculation. So when the election neared and tensions rose across the county, Benjamin saw something else rising: opportunity. Redham's gatherings grew more frequent and more drunken. Guests stayed late, leaving their coats in piles, their voices hoarse from political arguments, and their tempers stretched thin. Amid the chaos, Benjamin noticed a single detail that everyone else ignored. Redham never refused a cigar. He smoked when he was angry, when he was celebrating, when he was nervous, when he was tired. The man inhaled tobacco the way others breathed air. And Benjamin understood that any habit repeated often enough becomes a doorway. It started quietly. Benjamin listened more than he spoke, learned the routines of the house during the election events, paid attention to which cigars the master favored and how many were left. He learned which guests wandered the hall, which corners remained shadowed, which moments Redham liked to sit alone with glass and cigar, believing the world belonged to him. Benjamin's plan didn't come suddenly. It formed slowly, the way storms gather far out at sea, darkening a little more each night until horizon itself seems to thicken. He had access to herbs, roots, powders, small things that went unnoticed by the white men who believed knowledge belonged only to them. He understood which plants numbed, which sickened, and which silenced the heart without leaving obvious traces. Most importantly, he knew how much was needed to turn a luxury into a weapon. The truth is, Benjamin didn't need to hate Redham to act. Survival alone was fuel. But hate was there, quiet, steady, sharpening his thoughts in the dark. He knew he couldn't strike openly. He knew the body of a slave found near a dead master required no trial, no evidence, no explanation. It would be vengeance on the gallows, swift and unquestioned. If he was going to do this, he needed the act to hide in plain sight, disguised as a master's own indulgence. Election night provided the perfect setting. The house glowed with lantern light. Men laughed too loudly. Women whispered into lace gloves. Servants rushed from room to room carrying trays. Redham strutted through it all, cigar already clamped between his teeth, ash forming a trembling pillar. Benjamin watched him with a stillness that no one interpreted correctly. They saw a slave waiting for orders. They didn't see a man waiting for confirmation. When Redham returned to the study to retrieve more cigars, Benjamin knew his moment. He followed quietly, just far enough to be unnoticed, but close enough to act. The poisoned cigars were already prepared, placed near the bottom of the box, but not so deep that they looked suspicious. When Redham reached in, blind with celebration and self-importance, he lifted the top layer and chose from the ones that sat just beneath, muttering about saving the best for last. Benjamin stored that moment in his memory. The exact motion of Redham's fingers, the way the cedar box creaked, the rustle of paper. He didn't need to see which cigar was chosen. He had prepared several, knowing Redham's appetite would ensure at least one was lit before the night ended. The crowd never suspected a thing. When Redham returned to his guests, puffing proudly and exhaling smoke like a man declaring victory, they cheered with him. Benjamin passed nearby, carrying glasses, avoiding eye contact, listening for the subtle signs only he knew to expect. He heard the coughs first, soft, then sharp. He saw the shift in Redham's posture as his confidence wavered for a fraction of a second. He watched the man reach for his chest, unsure whether he was choking on tobacco or something deeper. To everyone else, it looked like a powerful man undone by indulgence. To Benjamin, it was a quiet unfurling of long-delayed justice. The night didn't end in panic at first. Redham tried to hide his struggle, unwilling to appear weak in front of his political allies. But the poison was patient, just like the man who delivered it. When the master finally collapsed, falling into the arms of men too drunk to process what had happened, Benjamin slipped out with the other servants, his expression unchanged. In confusion that followed, no one looked at him. No one even remembered he had been there. And as chaos filled the house, shouts, gasps, guests running for doctors who arrived too late, the only person who understood the truth stood quietly in the dark, breathing the cold night air as if it were the first freedom he had ever inhaled. Benjamin didn't need to smile. The silence after the storm was enough. The town awoke the next morning with the uneasy quiet that settles after a violent storm. Not the kind that tears down roofs, but the kind that shifts the air so strangely that even birds hesitate before singing again. News of Charles Redham's sudden death spread with the bitter chill of dawn, not shouted through streets, but carried cautiously, each retelling heavy with questions no one dared to ask directly. Culleton County had lost men before, sickness, duels, drunken fights gone too far, but this was different. This was a man of wealth, a political manipulator, a figure people courted when they wanted favors or feared when they owed him money. Men like Charles did not simply collapse during an election celebration. Yet that is exactly what had happened. Or so the official story claimed. The doctor, summoned in frantic haste the previous night, had taken one look at the body and declared the cause a heart most surely exhausted. It was the easiest conclusion, convenient for a household that needed answers quickly and a community that preferred calm over curiosity. But even the doctor's voice carried a tremor. He'd seen the bluish tint around the lips, the strange stiffness of the jaw, the look in Redham's eyes as if he had realized something dreadful in his final moment. Symptoms like those didn't settle easily into the category of natural death. They clung to suspicion, to the possibility of something hidden beneath the polite explanation. Still, the doctor wrote the certificate without protest. Some truths were simply too dangerous to speak aloud. Inside the estate, the atmosphere was sharper than the cold air outside. Servants moved with the stiff caution of people suddenly aware of how thin the line was between safety and suspicion. Mrs. Redham, Margaret, wandered from room to room, her face pale but her hands steady, insisting on decorum even as her voice cracked. She clung to propriety the way drowning people cling to floating debris. The household must not appear disordered, she kept repeating, though every corner of the house already felt cracked. Benjamin, meanwhile, maintained the same quiet presence he always had. He performed his duties exactly as expected, neither too slow nor too precise, never drawing the kind of attention that fear or relief might provoke. He understood that the day after a death was more dangerous than the act itself. This was when people replayed memories, searching for details they had overlooked. This was when suspicion drifted like smoke, seeking a target. He kept his face calm, movements smooth, breaths even. It wasn't guilt that required masking. Benjamin felt none. It was the awareness that justice, when delivered by those denied it, was not recognized as justice, but branded as crime. In that house, freedom had never been a right. It was a threat. One wrong look, one misplaced step, could turn the tide against him. But as he moved silently through the halls, he noticed something. No one looked at him at all. Grief consumed the family. Confusion consumed the guests who still lingered, whispering about the timing, the suddenness, the eerie fact that Redham had seemed perfectly fine until he lit that final cigar. Some spoke of destiny, others of divine judgment. None risked voicing the darkest speculation that a man like Redham had made enough enemies to fill a ledger. Benjamin observed everything. The hurried cleaning of the study where Redham had chosen the cigar, the hushed conversation between Margaret and the doctor, heavy with fear of scandal, the overseer pacing the grounds, muttering about how things didn't look right, though he lacked the courage to follow that thought toward its conclusion. And beneath it all, he sensed something else growing, the presence of an idea, slow and invisible, like roots moving beneath soil. The idea that Redham's death might not have been the tragedy people pretended it was. For years, the community had feared him more than they'd respected him. He had collected debts he never allowed to be repaid, ruined men in backroom deals, punished slaves even other masters deemed valuable. Now that he was gone, conversations began to tilt, subtly but unmistakably. Some people sounded almost relieved. Benjamin listened to these murmurs with the calm of someone who had predicted their arrival. He did not feel triumph. Triumph was loud, foolish, reckless. What he felt was steadiness, balance restored, a necessary end delivered without spectacle. Still, danger lingered. The overseer, a man named Trask, had always believed violence was the only way to maintain order. He looked at the slaves with open contempt, treating them like animals who deceived him simply by breathing. As the hours passed, Trask's suspicion sharpened. He prowled the estate with the tension of a hunter sensing something hiding in the underbrush. At one point, he stopped Benjamin near the smokehouse and asked too casually, "You were near the study last night, weren't you?" Benjamin didn't flinch. "Master called for wine," he said softly. "I brought it." Trask searched his face for cracks, for panic, for guilt. He found none. Benjamin's expression remained as unreadable as ever. The overseer grunted and walked away, though the question still hung between them, heavy as a blade not yet drawn. But as the day unfolded, the truth became clear. No one truly wanted an investigation. Not Margaret, because scandal would stain her family name. Not the guests, because admitting suspicion meant admitting they'd stood within a murderer's reach. Not the doctor, whose reputation could be shredded if he overturned his own conclusion. And not the community, which quietly understood that the world might be gentler without Charles Redham in it. Thus, the narrative settled into place. A powerful man had smoked too much, drunk too deeply, celebrated too hard, and his body had simply given out. A neat ending, a respectable death, a truth shallow enough to be palatable. Benjamin watched as the coffin was prepared, as the body was washed, as whispers softened into acceptance. No one asked about the cigars. No one opened the box again. No one counted how many were left or how many had been touched. That omission was not ignorance. It was willful blindness. People often say history is written by the victors, but in places like Culloden County, history was written by the comfortable, those who chose peace over truth, convenience over questions. Redham's death slid quietly into that tradition. The town mourned him publicly but moved on with suspicious speed, eager to resume life without the thunder of his temper shaking their doors. Benjamin remained invisible through it all. Surrounded by grief, suspicion, relief, and shifting power, he carried the calm of a man who had reclaimed something long denied. Not freedom. He knew that was still a distant hope, but dignity, the ability to shape fate rather than suffer under it. The house would change. The county would change. Redham's absence would ripple through farms, markets, and elections for years. People would speak his name with forced reverence, but their eyes would reveal a different truth. Some were glad he was gone. Benjamin alone understood what had tipped the scales, but he didn't hold this knowledge with arrogance. He held it with the quiet certainty of someone who had endured enough cruelty for a lifetime and answered it not with rage, but with precision. Silence was his shield, stillness his refuge. And as the sun set on the day after Redham's death, Benjamin moved through the house with the same deliberate calm as always, unseen, unremarked upon, but no longer powerless. The weight of that difference rested in his chest, warm and steady, like a small ember that refused to burn out. Benjamin observed Elias from a distance as the hours unfolded. The magistrate asked questions that seemed harmless about debts, land disputes, and household records, but occasionally his inquiries veered closer to the night of Redham's death. He mentioned the election, the cigars, the timing, the strange illness that overtook Redham during the celebration. Each detail fell like a pebble tossed into still water. Benjamin remained unseen, staying in the background as he always had. But Elias had an eye for patterns, for inconsistencies that others dismissed. He questioned servants, reviewed documents, and walked through rooms as though searching for echoes. One afternoon, when the estate was quieter than usual, Elias found Benjamin alone near the well. The air was crisp, the kind that carries sound more sharply. Elias approached not with suspicion, but with a weary bluntness. "You were with him that night," he said. Benjamin didn't respond, didn't nod, didn't flinch. Silence had always been his strongest shield. Elias exhaled, rubbing his gloved hands together. "I'm not here to accuse you," he continued softly. "I'm here because I knew Charles, not as a friend, as a judge of character. And I knew he had a talent for making enemies." Benjamin's gaze remained fixed on the water. He waited. Elias lowered his voice further. "I've seen poisonings before, not the kind done out of malice for anyone who crosses your path. The deliberate kind, the patient kind, the kind delivered by someone who has suffered quietly for years." A long pause settled between them. "I didn't come to expose what happened," Elias said. "I came to understand it." Benjamin's jaw tightened slightly, so subtly that most men would have missed it. But Elias noticed. "Tell me nothing," Elias added. "You owe the world no confession. But understand this. If Redham had lived, the injustices he inflicted would have continued, spread, and worsened. Whatever occurred that night, perhaps the county is safer for it." There was no triumph in his voice, no accusation, no praise, only a resigned understanding, as if he were weighing two versions of history and acknowledging that the darker one might still be the more human. Benjamin met Elias's gaze for the first time then, calm, steady, and unreadable. Elias offered a slow nod. It was not approval. It was not agreement. It was acknowledgement, not of the act, but of the burden. After that conversation, Elias finished his review quickly and quietly. He left the estate without pressing further questions. Whatever he found, whatever he suspected, he chose to bury it, not out of fear but acceptance. Benjamin watched him ride away, the horse's hooves kicking up soft clouds of dust. He knew the truth was now shared between two men who would never name it aloud, a truth that would float between them like smoke from a cigar slowly burning to ash. Life continued. Seasons changed. The estate evolved. People forgot the details of Redham's final night, though some whispers still resurfaced whenever elections came around, as though the spirit of that night stirred with political tension. Benjamin aged with the land, his face weathering but his eyes never losing their focus. To newcomers, he was simply an old, quiet man who worked steadily and rarely spoke. To those who had been at the estate long enough, he was something else, a figure who seemed untouched by time's cruelty, carrying a stillness they could not explain. In quiet moments, when the sun dipped low and shadows stretched long across the fields, Benjamin sometimes allowed himself a single reflection. Not pride, not fear, but certainty. He had done what history would never record, what justice would never acknowledge, what survival had demanded, and though the world would never know it, his act had shifted the balance of cruelty in ways that echoed far beyond the walls of the state. Some stories are never written in books or judged in courts. They exist in the space between morality and necessity, in the places where silence speaks louder than truth. Benjamin's story lived there, haunting, unspoken, and undeniably real.